So historical materialism is, sort of as the name would imply, a method of understanding history and the way that societies have developed throughout history. So to put it as simply as I can, historical materialism argues that history is driven not by ideas or changes in values and principles that develop over time, but rather changes in the material conditions of a society. So in opposition to this idea of historical materialism, we have this concept of idealism. And idealism kind of argues that if we want to understand historical change, we need to understand the ideas that drive those changes. All of this is somewhat abstract, so, to kind of pin this down a little bit, I want us to think about a specific example. So if we think about a concrete example that I think will be really familiar for our American audience, at least, we can think about the American Revolution and sort of how we, as people trying to understand historical development, can explain the American Revolution. And most of us have been taught an explanation of this in school at various times, and that explanation is largely an idealist explanation. So it kind of goes something like this. When the colonists came to America, they began to develop their own unique cultural identity, separate from England. And this identity was based around principles of freedom and liberty. And when these ideas came into conflict with the tyranny and the authoritarianism of the British king, the colonists rose up in defense of liberty and freedom. The revolution was motivated more or less by this kind of noble belief in these great ideas. It was a conflict between freedom and tyranny, and the republic it eventually founded was characterized by a love for freedom and liberty. So this is kind of the story we've been told, right? These heroic people who rose up in defense of these heroic principles. It's about the principles and ideas that drove history forward. Now, a Marxist wouldn't really agree with this explanation because it frames the entire conflict as driven by ideas and happening in the realm of idealism. So in contrast, Marxists would offer an historical materialist explanation of the revolution. And that explanation might go something like this. And let's see if we can tease out some of these differences. So the Marxists might say that when the colonists came to America, they sort of began to engage in forms of commerce and trade that competed with the old monarchical structure of Britain, right? So you have these people who start to become merchants here in America, and their interests are competing with the interests of the king and of the old feudal society in Britain, where taxation and the rule of a monarch is taken for granted. So this independent merchant class begins to develop here in America, and the needs of this young class find themselves at odds with the right of the British king to, tax, regulate, and even prohibit the free trade of goods. So under this view, the revolution began because of the ways in which the king economically interfered with the development of this young class of merchants. And this young class realized that they needed a new form of government that could allow the development of loosely regulated markets so they could grow rich. So the revolution under the Marxist view then was a conflict between two economic systems, an emerging but still young capitalist system of trade and sort of the old remnants of monarchical feudalism. So the republic then that was founded was built to ensure the dominance of this newly emerging class, an economy that would be favorable to them and laws that would allow them to develop. And this would be the more materialist explanation. So when we're looking at this explanation, we're not looking to what great ideas and principles and beliefs drove history forward, but what material economic changes in how a society functions were pushing things forward. So this hopefully kind of gives you a broad sense of the difference between idealism and historical materialism. Historical materialism understands change in terms of material conditions of a society. And material conditions, this term that we're using, refers to sort of the underlying economic realities of a society and how they are managed. So the term not only refers to, say, factories, natural resources, the labor force, or the technology used in meeting the economic needs of a society, but it also refers to how all of these realities are managed, how they're divided up and structured. So the material conditions of a society don't simply refer to what kind of products are produced, what sort of work is performed, or what sort of resources are available, but also to who profits from the sale of those products and how they are produced, how work is divided within a society, and how ownership of resources is managed. So, when Marxists try to understand a society, they attempt to analyze it from those material conditions and then explain how those conditions shape the rest of society. So, for example, Marxists don't understand capitalism in terms of abstract ideas like voluntary free exchange or economic freedom to buy and sell, but rather as an arrangement where a class of laborers sell their labor for a wage to a class of capitalists who profit from that working class's labor. So, for Marxists, if we want to understand capitalism, we have to understand what these fundamental material conditions of capitalism. So why does all this matter, though? This is, again, all sort of broad, philosophical, and somewhat heady. Why are Marxists really emphasizing this idea of materialism? And the answer to that is that Marxists believe that materialism has really exceptional explanatory power. By looking at the world through a materialist lens, we can understand the actual forces which drive historical change, and we can even understand how change might potentially play out in the future. And even more importantly, Marxists believe that materialism allows us to sort of see through the propaganda we've been fed about how our society functions. If we understand capitalism in terms of material conditions and the way those conditions produce exploitation, for example, then we might be less persuaded by capitalism's appeals to lofty ideas like economic freedom and liberty. By insisting that material reality is more important than ideas, historical materialism allows us to see the way that lofty and abstract ideas have been used to distract us from the actual violences and exploitation of capitalism, and allows us to explain why capitalism isn't really based on freedom or liberty, but on intense forms of oppression and exploitation. So this, in the end, is a very surface level explanation of what historical materialism mean and what Marxists mean by materialism. But hopefully it's kind of at least provide some clarification for people who have seen those terms but not really known what they mean.
That's really, really well said. It's a difficult question, and you handled it expertly. And another thing I would add to that is just thinking about, the idealism of thinking about American history, and then, as you articulated so wonderfully, the Marxist materialist view of the American Revolution. And one of the ways we can see that the materialist view is superior is the sort of contradictions that exist within the idealistic version of American history, because, you're writing things down like all men are created equal while you have slaves, and while you're actively engaged in an ongoing genocide against the native population. Well, if you're understanding the American Revolution in the terms of idealism, those things don't really make sense. You do some turning and bending to try to make sense of them and figure out what it was, and you might chalk it up to the hypocrisy of the individual founding fathers. But by understanding it as an emerging class, by understanding it materially, you can see that slavery was a process by which you brought over free labor to jumpstart capitalism for this new class. And we can see the genocide of Native Americans as a process of primitive accumulation, which we'll define later, a primitive accumulation by which you take over land necessary to build up this new mode of production, capitalism. And so these things make much more sense under that light than they do under the idealist light. And to give one more example, at the risk of being a little too philosophical, I think a lot of people at least know the basic outlines of the debate between Hegel and Marx, even if you don't know Hegelian philosophy, which I don't think is necessary for this example. But basically, Hegelian dialectics was this idea that human societies and history developed through what Hegel would refer to as the absolute spirit, but is really the sort of increasing clarity of the idea, capital I, and that all the things that happen down on earth is really subordinate to this overall striving of sort of the realm of ideas to come to completion in the absolute spirit. Marx famously turned that on its head, meaning that he refused to understand the development of societies throughout history as an idea unfolding or an absolute spirit, but rather by the material basis, the economic mode of production, the ways that the basic necessities of life were created and distributed in a given society. And so what Marx did with Hegel is he kept the dialectical sort of and historical understanding of society's evolution, but added or materialized it and rejected the idealism of Hegel. So again, that might be a little abstract for some, but for others that might help sort of simplify and concretize this dispute, particularly in the realm of German philosophy, which Marxism came out of.